So you guys know that I love The Chosen. We have a whole separate channel called The Chosen Sleuth where you can look at all of the deep dives and intricacies that come along with The Chosen itself, especially coming up in season 4 quite soon. But in this video, I wanted to talk to you guys about all the things that I've learned because of The Chosen. Not necessarily that The Chosen does like the best job of teaching these individual things, but these are things that The Chosen forced me to learn because I needed to know more about it to understand the show in a better way. So I'm going to dive into my top 10 things that The Chosen forced me to learn. And first things first, we're going to start off with Sadducees and Pharisees. Now, a lot of these things I've heard of before, or I've had some knowledge of before, while not having a full grasp on what exactly is kind of going on or how they work or who they are. And you guys have seen me work out some of this stuff in real time. And this is one of those things, Sadducees and Pharisees. I knew that these were two different things, but I didn't know how they coexisted or what the differences were between Sadducees and Pharisees. And I wasn't a novice, obviously, when I started watching The Chosen. I'm someone who went through Bible school. I'm someone who went through university. I'm someone who went through being a pastor for 10 years, right? But I'm still missing pieces of this because, I just never learned it. I never came across it in a certain way, or it never clicked for me in the proper way. So just a quick kind of understanding of what these are. Pharisees and Sadducees are really the leaders of the Jewish world during the time of Jesus. They have a huge hold on what exactly goes on. They are the ones that make up the governing bodies, which we're going to talk about in a second, but they are the ones who really make a lot of decisions for the Jewish people. And a lot of these, especially the high priests, which are from the Sadducees, would have had direct contact with Rome in order to control certain things during that time. So these two different groups really, they butt heads a lot, but they also work together in order to form, what was known as the leaders, the leaders of the Jewish people. So the differences really quick, the quickest differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees are what they believe biblically. For example, the Sadducees only believe in the first 5 books of the Bible. The Pharisees believe in all of the Old Testament, okay? Then the Sadducees also don't even believe in an afterlife or a resurrection at the end of the day. This is one of the biggest things that they argued about constantly. And so the Pharisees did. They believed in an afterlife, and they believed they believed in a resurrection to come later on, okay? So these were two major things that I didn't really know, right? I didn't really know what the Sadducees were all about, where they came from, what their role was. More so the Pharisees I understood, but the Sadducees were a really blank spot for me that I didn't realize was a blank spot before kind of diving into it. Now, next up, we have the Sanhedrin. Speaking about the Sadducees and the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin is the governing body in Jerusalem, or everywhere actually. There's many different Sanhedrin that governed certain locations. So, for example, there may have been a Sanhedrin in place in Capernaum, right? And in this Sanhedrin would have been a certain number of judges who would have basically taken cases amongst the people to settle disputes and to talk about different things in that specific area. Now, the Great Sanhedrin, which we've talked about quite a bit, is in Jerusalem. And this is where we find people like the high priest Caiaphas, or Hillel and Shammai, or we talk about Nicodemus, or we talk about Joseph of Arimathea. All of these people were part of the Great Sanhedrin, most likely in Jerusalem. And so this was a group of exactly 72 members of this great judge group that would, again, settle disputes and make decisions and talk about these different things throughout time. Now, if you've heard this saying, our guide when we go to Israel always says, if you have 10 Jews, you have 11 opinions, right? And so the Sanhedrin is the place where they would really battle that out and have these quite intense conversations and arguments, and they would talk about the different things that are going on during the time. Now, this also included impact from Rome later on, where they had to appease Rome in some circumstances and then obviously try to level out the people as well. And there was different hierarchy within the Sanhedrin, going up to different presidents and different things like that within the Sanhedrin there. So really unique group, really interesting group that I had to learn a lot about when I was going through The Chosen. Now, this next one's a fun one. It's fun to say as well. Pequ the fish. This is an interesting one because it only shows up once in the beginning of The Chosen, but I did think that this was an interesting thing that kind of really brought me into understanding more of the Jewish culture and more into studying things even beyond this word specifically. So if you remember in the beginning of The Chosen, I think it's actually in the first episode or maybe the second episode, Peter kind of, he says it twice, Simon/Peter, he says it twice, I think, in the first season. And Pequ Nefesh is kind of this breaking of the law for the purpose of saving a life, okay? So in The Chosen, Simon uses it in this way. He says, if I can't fish, I can't pay my taxes, my family is going to be killed. My family is going to be put in jail. My family is going to be, they're going to be in danger, basically. So I can use the Pequ Nefesh, basically this rule that allows me to break the Sabbath. It allows me to break these different things in order for me to save my family. This is a really interesting thing because it's like a breaking of the law in order to save a life. And that was basically the only way that you could break the law, or at least one of the main ways during that time. Now, this is another one. The main place that we actually see this mentioned in The Chosen is season 2, episode 4, talking about the oral tradition, because Yanni actually yells at the disciples and at Jesus when he heals Jesse at the pool of Bethesda. This is a really interesting part because I didn't quite understand the full extent of what the oral tradition was. I understood that the Jews had 613 laws that they went by, but then there was oral traditions above and beyond that to kind of like put in their own rules beyond what God had given them. So, for example, in that episode, Yanni says that you're not allowed to pick up your mat and move it, or like pick anything up from your dwelling and move it on a Sabbath day. And of course, this is not in the 613 laws. This is something that they've added on top of it through the oral tradition in order to basically like keep themselves from getting even close to breaking the law, right? So for example, if this is the line of the law, then the oral tradition kind of keeps you way over here so that you never even get close, even though all of this is permitted, right? The oral tradition was really, really hard on a lot of different people, and it made it really, really difficult to do anything. The law is already impossible to keep as it is. The oral tradition made it even more impossible and made it really, really hard on a lot of people during that time. So it was really unique to kind of look into that and think more about what that oral tradition actually was. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying this small portion of our live stream and you want to see the entire thing, it's over on our Patreon at patreon.com/thesnipelife. This is by far the best way to help support us, and so we put the entire live stream up there for you to watch all at once if you'd like to. Anyway, go click that link in the description down below if you're interested, and we'd love to see you over there. Now, I mentioned this earlier, but this is another huge thing that I didn't really know about, and that is the schools of Shammai and Hillel. These are the two major schools of Judaism that play a huge part in how the Jewish society worked during the time of Jesus. Hillel being the more lenient teacher and Shammai being the more rigid teacher. Now we hear about this again in season 2 of The Chosen, and we get introduced to Shammai at the end of that season. I believe in The Chosen, Hillel is already either retired or he may be dead by the time of The Chosen's kind of timeline there. I think his son Shimon is the one that's in charge right now, and then Shimon's son Gamaliel is the one that is kind of in charge later on, and he's the one that actually, I believe, trains like Paul and stuff during that whole timeline. So anyway, these are the two main schools during the time of Jesus, and Hillel is really one of the major ones that is really, really prevalent during the time of Jesus. He's the more popular one because Shammai is so harsh and so rigid. A lot of people gravitate more towards Hillel in order to understand his teaching better. So here's a great example. In chapter 5 of Matthew, during the Sermon on the Mount, there's a section where it talks about divorce, okay? And in that section, you hear Jesus in this whole section of scripture. He says, you've heard it said this, but I tell you this, right? And so he's kind of clarifying what really should be happening because they've heard it said in a wrong way, but the correct interpretation is what Jesus is saying here, okay? So with Hillel would actually say that you can pretty much divorce your wife for any reason, right? Like there's not like, there doesn't have to be this like very specific, like rigid use case for divorcing your wife. And Jesus is saying, like, no, that's wrong, right? There's only one use case where you can divorce, and that is adultery, etc., right? And so Jesus was like clarifying what the actual law was supposed to be, while Hillel was using, again, that oral tradition to kind of make things a little bit looser, make things a little bit more easy for people that were kind of going around. Now, Shammai would say, like, no, you cannot, right? On the rigid side of things, he would make it really, really hard in some circumstances. One of the examples I love using is a wedding day, right? If you have an ugly bride on her wedding day, Hillel would say every bride is beautiful on her wedding day, right? Because he wouldn't want to make her feel bad, and of course it's her wedding day. Of course she's allowed to be beautiful, right? Shammai would just straight up tell her she's ugly, right? Or just not talk to her, because he doesn't want to lie. He doesn't want to bear false testimony in any way whatsoever, right? There's no loopholes there for him. And so it was a very serious thing that he kind of went through there. Now, this next one was also really interesting. I still need to learn a lot more about this, but from what I have dove into, it's been a ton of fun. And that is the Roman hierarchy. So there's a lot of different Roman people that we see within Scripture and within the Chosen specifically. We see Pontius Pilate, we see Atticus, we see obviously Quintus and Gaius, and then all the people that are kind of around them, right? So I really had to dive into the Roman hierarchy to understand more about what these different people were doing and what positions they actually held. For example, Gaius is now a primi ordine. This is a massive position within Roman society. He actually is in charge of like over 100 soldiers. It might be like way more than that. I can't remember off the top of my head. Like I said, I need to do more research on this specifically. But Gaius is like a big general guy. Like he's in charge of a ton of different soldiers, especially within Capernaum. A primi ordine would have been a massive person to have there. Whereas a regular centurion is only in charge of a specific group of people. The primi ordine is in charge of several different centurions. And so that just kind of continues up the hierarchy, and it becomes a really, really intense thing overall. But another thing that I had to kind of study and figure out a little bit. Now, this next one is a word that I had never heard before, and this is Shiva. And Shiva is, as we all know now, is a funeral, essentially. It's a 7-day long mourning period within Jewish society. I don't really have any Jewish friends that I've seen do this or attend these, and I've never really heard the word before. And so when I heard it in the beginning of season 2, episode 1, I wasn't sure what this word was or what it meant. And so I had to do a lot of studying on what this funeral process was like for the Jewish people. And so this was a really interesting moment for me to kind of see what was going on in that specific case. Now, this next one, I did a lot of research on this because I wanted to make sure that I was talking about this in the right way. And that is Matthew as a publican. And so, yes, I understood that Matthew was a tax collector. I understood that Matthew was like kind of a bad guy, but I didn't understand the full extent of who Matthew was and kind of what was going on with him as a publican. So within Roman society, you have to understand that a publican is not someone who is forced into this. It's not someone who is hired for this job in a traditional sense. It's someone that basically volunteers their time to Rome in order so that they can steal money from their people, okay? They actually bid to see who will get the highest amount of taxes for Rome, and whoever bids the highest wins essentially that position. So Matthew, being a publican, he had in mind that he was going to steal money from his people, not only for himself, but so that Rome could get not only the taxes they deserved, but maybe even more than they actually were owed. This is a really intense thing, right? To understand who Matthew is as an apostle, to understand who Matthew becomes later on in life, we really have to understand how far down he was. And not only that he did this as a job, but how people hated him for doing it. I think this is a great thing that The Chosen has done, showing the conflict between Simon and Matthew and showing that Matthew did something wrong. It wasn't just this thing that was thrown upon him or something that he just happened to be a part of. He was really hurting people. And so I think that's something that we really need to understand when it comes to Matthew as a publican, that he wasn't just a random dude that kind of did this stuff. He picked this path, and he had to fight to get to that position in the first place. Even though he started when he was like 14 or 15 in the show, which is a little bit weird, but maybe they did back then. I don't know. Anyway, next thing is locations and travel speed. Now, if David Tate is watching this, I'm sure we're both laughing very hard at this one, because me and David Tate, who runs another YouTube channel here on YouTube, we've talked about this quite a bit because The Chosen does this wrong like a lot. Primarily travel speed. Now, locations, they do often change as well, but primarily travel speed is a huge thing that The Chosen actually gets wrong. And when I was researching this and like kind of going through how this actually works in the time of Jesus, there's a lot of things that just do not make sense location-wise and travel speed-wise within The Chosen. For example, in the beginning of season 3, when Andrew goes from Chorazin, and then he goes all the way down to Machaerus, which is by the Dead Sea, and then back up to the north to Capernaum, this should have been several days, if not weeks of travel, okay? This should have been a long time. However, he does it in like 26 to 48 hours. And he's like real quick, like just like mega speed Andrew. And so there's a lot of different moments within The Chosen where this actually happens, where in the script, they don't leave any room for travel, and yet it seems like they travel hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles all the time, all over the place. So it's a little bit inaccurate when it comes to travel and the speed of that travel, for sure. Now, this last one is really interesting for me, is holidays. Holidays is another thing that I've had to do a lot of research about when it comes to Rosh Hashanah or Purim or all these different holidays that are shown in The Chosen, especially for season 3. It was another one of these things where I was really confused in season 3 because, one, the locations and times and travel speed was really off, but also the date of the calendar was really off. And because of that, it really hindered how I was kind of consuming season 3. And so I had to go into the holidays to figure out what is wrong here, because it seems really off. And as I dove into the holidays, that was another location where The Chosen, they very confidently and specifically decided not to actually care when the holidays landed in their timeline. This is probably one of the biggest things that I disagree with when it comes to the writing of the show. I think there is definitely a way that they could have followed the exact calendar through the life of Jesus and through the ministry of Jesus. But the holidays are like really off. One of the ways that I tell people about this is it's as if The Chosen put Christmas in like August, and then they put like Valentine's Day in November, and then they put they put Thanksgiving in July. And yet everybody's like, oh, this is awesome, this is cool. Like, if we did that with an American show and switched around the American holidays, it would make no sense whatsoever. And yet The Chosen does this quite a bit, especially in season 3 is the worst culprit of this. But I had to learn a ton of holiday stuff when it comes to season 3 specifically. I had to really dive into that. So anyway, these are 10 of the top things that I learned from The Chosen, all 3 seasons so far, and I'm sure I'll learn much more. If you want me to do another episode of this, let me know in the comments down below, and I'd love to hear what you learned from The Chosen so far as well.